rates in 2016. The Fed was planning 4 rate increases during the year.
So I don't know. That's the best answer. One of the things that they've told us that they're going to take into consideration is current economic conditions. And there are expectations and forecasts for what's going to happen to economic conditions. This is one of the magics of monetary policy. Right? Monetary policy has been described as part art, part science. And as a professional economist, that really is true. There's part of it is the forecasts that are made by both board staff as well as the Reserve Bank staff. But part of it is also having a good understanding of what we think is going on in the economy overall. And this is the reason why you want to have good, strong folks on the committee who are able to operate independently.
Other questions? No cards, pass it forward. While you're jotting down ideas, I'll ask a question as a layperson in this field, and actually you guys are the experts. What would you recommend as sources for news and information to help us get through the filter of the day-to-day, minute-to-minute news cycle? Because you both touched on the need to look long-term, and yet the media has that need to fill every segment of their day. Where would you recommend we go to get good long-term information?
And thanks. And I think that's a great question, and I think it's going to be very different depending upon how deep you want to dive in yourselves. But I think more than anything, and certainly what we would recommend at Franklin Templeton is working with a financial advisor, working with someone, if you don't have the time personally to do it yourself, who can really weed through all of this information, figure out what information is important, help build a plan that makes sense for you individually, and help stick to that plan. When you get questions like this and questions of risk, I always compare myself to people I know very well. I take my dad as an example, and just we're completely different in how we manage. If he were to lose 3 or 4%, he'd be up all night, not able to sleep, and that would be just the way it is. So the way he has to invest and the way he has to get his information and build his plan is much different than perhaps myself, who's much more comfortable with the information in the industry. So I think, quite honestly, that is a personal question, but I think having a financial professional that can help you along the way oftentimes can help you from overreacting to some of that noise.
One of the things I will say, and I would have said this before I worked at the Federal Reserve as well, which is that the Reserve Banks produce just huge amounts of really high quality material. These surveys that are coming out, whether it be from the Philadelphia Fed or from others, whether it be in terms of manufacturing or non-manufacturing sectors, but also these surveys of professional forecasters give you a lot of really valuable information, because you're getting the consensus forecasts from some of the leading economists in the country. So I would say reading some of those materials are very, very valuable. I think there's a number of print media sources that are very, very reputable and very good and do a very good job. But I think the other thing is making sure you're reading many sources. One of the things I always am telling my students in the college classroom, particularly my seniors, is you can't lie your research on one article that you read. So making sure you're looking at those things. But in terms of I think the other thing I'm always trying to explain to them is the idea that, particularly with television news, cable news, ratings matter, right? You're trying to sell ratings. So making sure you're looking at many different sources, and oftentimes those sources are print.
Very good, thank you. Next question for both of you. How much national debt can we handle? What is the probability of us getting to not being able to meet our interest payments?
That's a deep one. Well, it's, I guess the important way to answer that question is the way that a country can handle debt is much different than how an individual can handle debt. And when you're thinking of the United States, for example, the top credit on the planet, for that matter, I have full faith and confidence that they can manage a debt load. And if you think of, well, what happens if we got to a point where they couldn't? Well, from a personal standpoint, if I didn't have the money to pay my mortgage, well, I don't have a printing press of money in my basement. Therefore, I would default on that loan and I wouldn't be able to pay back my creditors, and we'd go through that kind of process. When you're talking about a country, you do have the ability, as we have shown through the financial crisis, to print money, to create monetary policy, to be able to deal with high debt loads. And so while an individual may default, the way that a country might get out of a high level of debt would be through inflation, right? If they started printing so much money to cover their debt, the way that that would solve itself is from so much money being out there that inflation comes into the system, and the value of that money in essence goes down. And so if we look at what that is today, that certainly does not seem to be the case. I'd say if there was a fear in the marketplace, it's more of deflation than it's of inflation. And to put a number on it, I think would be very difficult to do, but I think it would manifest itself in inflation, and that would be a signal that that maybe the debt load is a bit heavy for the U.S.
So I want to leave you with the understanding that price stability is at the utmost interest and concern of the Federal Reserve. So, we as an institution are committed to price stability in the United States, and Congress expects us to do that, and that has happened. I think one of the things that we have seen over time is that the Fed has been very aggressive about working to maintain stability, particularly on the lower level, making sure that we work to keep away from deflation. We only have to look to Japan in the 90s and 2000s to see what happens to an economy that doesn't ward off deflation. In terms of debt, one thing is that Reserve Bank economists generally don't talk significantly about fiscal policy, but one thing I always point out to my students is, where have people fled to within the last couple of weeks as they've gotten out of the market? They fled to U.S. Treasuries in a huge way. The U.S. economy is the largest economy in the world, and just as Mike said, I think a lot of people view the economy and the budget as they would their own lives, and that is not the case when you're talking about a macro economy. So I think the U.S. has shown tremendous resilience, both as an economy. Countries around the world have continued to show significant faith in the U.S. economy to continue to produce and to be able to pay that debt off in the long run. So I don't see anything on the horizon as being any concern for our abilities in that way.
Get our next question. Thank you, Bethany. If the economy were to slide toward recession, what tools might the Fed have left in the toolbox to provide needed stimulus?
Well, I think one of the things is I'm not privy to all the things that are in the toolbox, but I will say this: they're very proactive about thinking ahead. It's not, during the crisis, one of the things that the media was beating on were a lot of the facilities that came out during the crisis that were put in place to specifically break up significant log jams in credit markets. They were being billed by people, whether it be in the industry or being on television, saying, the Fed's just trying to throw things at it. The fact of the matter is many of those facilities had actually been conceived and thought of well in advance. The other thing is making use of facilities that are stylized on other facilities that have been successful in countries around the world. I would not want to predict what they would necessarily use, but there are things that are certainly available. We saw many of those used during the crisis. But again, I don't think that any of us are forecasting at this point of a recession. We're continuing to look towards growth.
Next question. What economic indicators are best for assessing the local economy in the Lebanon Valley?
I don't even know that I can answer that question as someone who outside of Lebanon County and just taking a macro view myself. So I mean, there are a lot of indicators as a whole that we have to look at. I mean, really into the hundreds in terms of what we're looking at in terms of business activity, employment, wage growth. But to do it on such a local level is really beyond my personal expertise. I don't know if
One of the things that I always try and explain to my students, they're working on getting together research projects for this year, for this semester, for their senior projects, and one of the things that data is a big issue. Right? We don't collect as a country the level of specificity at the county level that we have at the state and national levels. But you do have MSA level, metropolitan statistical area data for Lebanon County and things like housing starts. Business activity that's there. So those kinds of things are available. But I think the other thing to think about is the degree to which what you're doing in Lebanon is part of the greater state or the greater national economy. Because just as the US economy is operating in certainly global marketplace, so too is a county operating both in a national as well as in a global context.
Additional questions? We've got time for a couple more yet. I'll inject one. Jack, go ahead.
I'm a little confused. We've got lower oil prices that is contributing positively to industries like travel, automobile sales, home energy costs, and yet I keep seeing these market reports that the stock market is falling because of lower oil prices. Where does those two thoughts converge?
The easy answer to that is the market doesn't always make sense. And I would say exactly what you're saying. If you're looking from a percentage of what industries are benefited to what industries are hurt from oil prices coming down, it's about 15% of our economy is negatively affected by oil prices coming down, and approximately 85% that benefit. And that's not only the fact that you have industries with lower input costs, lower travel costs, just that lower price, but it also is all about the consumer as a whole as well. And if we think of everyone across the country and the difference of putting, $3.50, $4 gas in our cars to, on the way back from the airport this morning, it was $1.85. And the fact that that is putting more money in people's pockets and can help drive different areas. And so when you see one sector like that driving indiscriminate selling, oftentimes that is the news making that a reason more than it actually is a reason. So if you're looking at the sell-off, I do believe energy is certainly part of it. Fears on China slowing is a part of it. Fears of global growth and U.S. growth is a part of it. And so I do believe energy, for one, that trend will break, because I do think it brings more benefit to our economy than it brings hardship.
I think certainly one thing is about expectations, right? So one of the key things that we learned out of the period of stagflation in the late 1970s and early 1980s was that the role of expectations matters a lot in economies. And so one of the things that we're certainly seeing in terms of equity markets is the fact that expectations have been significantly shocked by this significant drop in oil prices. So I think some of the sell-off that you're seeing is being driven by the fact that there are significant changes in expectations, both about what energy prices are going to be, but also about what's going to happen with China. You look at a number, and one could make a list of these, of stocks that were expected to be driven by sales in China, and again, expectations that may have been overinflated, maybe not. When you change expectations, that's going to affect equity markets. But on the macroeconomy as a whole, we have this significant set of transmission mechanisms that have different lags that take place. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is it's going to take a little bit of time before all of the